What you are about to discover will forever change your perception of the past and make you doubt every word from school textbooks. Because the main evidence of the greatest global deception is hidden not in ruined ancient cities, but on the dining tables of 18th century monarchs. Watch this material to the very end, and you will understand how simple mathematics, basic physics, and logic demolish the official historical chronology to its foundations. You will be convinced that our recent ancestors possessed infrastructure that completely contradicts the laws of survival with those primitive technologies that academics impose on us. We are accustomed to unconditionally believe that people of the past traveled through mud on creaking wooden carts, lit cold palaces with dim rushlights, and were totally dependent on the whims of harsh nature. But as soon as we dig a little into the logistics of their daily luxury, this primitive picture starts to crack at the seams, revealing a hidden reality. We are forced to believe in logistical and technological absurdity that physically could not exist. And we will begin our investigation with the most exquisite, yet at the same time the most deadly product that could be imagined on the tables of the world's nobility. The talk will be about commonplace sea oysters and the great oyster paradox that historians diligently avoid. Open the famous memoirs of Giacomo Casanova, or study the detailed Chamberlain journals and personal archives of Empress Catherine II. You will be amazed to discover that regular, sometimes daily, feasts with the freshest sea oysters were an absolute routine norm in continental Vienna, in the very heart of Paris, and in deeply landlocked Moscow. Historical documents are teeming with the most detailed descriptions of how hundreds and thousands of live mollusks were continuously served at imperial balls, diplomatic receptions, and private dinners of influential aristocrats. We are told, with a straight face, that these delicate sea creatures were simply loaded into wooden barrels, placed on ordinary horse-drawn carts, and transported across the vast expanses of Europe to the residences of rulers. It sounds quite logical for a person not accustomed to asking extra questions. But if we turn on critical thinking and arm ourselves with the simplest knowledge from biology, this neat academic fairy tale instantly turns into a life-threatening farce. Let's carefully examine the physiology of this popular seafood. The oyster is an incredibly fragile living organism that exists within the strictest ecological constraints. From the very moment it is extracted from its native seawater, an irreversible and very fast timer starts. The biological survival limit of an oyster without water is a maximum of 5 days, and this figure is achievable exclusively under the condition of providing ideal, stable coolness, proper air circulation, and complete absence of shaking. As soon as the oyster dies, its delicate protein begins to decompose at a monstrous speed. Inside the closed shell, the most powerful cadaveric poisons form instantly, and bacteria multiply rapidly, turning the elite delicacy into a real biological weapon. Consuming a dead oyster causes severe toxico-infection, acute renal failure, paralysis of the nervous system, and, in the overwhelming majority of cases, leads to a painful death. At the then level of official medicine, one such spoiled mollusk would mean guaranteed death for any emperor. No one in their right mind would risk their own life for the dubious pleasure of swallowing a half-rotten substance. Therefore, the mollusks reached the tables in Moscow and Vienna absolutely alive and fresh. And now let's confront this immutable biological truth with the harsh logistics of the 18th century. Official history unequivocally asserts that all land transport of that time relied exclusively on animal traction. Imagine a heavy wooden carriage loaded to the brim with heavy barrels of oysters. The roads of Europe and the Russian Empire in that era were predominantly dirt tracks. After rains, they turned into impassable mud where wheels got stuck, and in dry weather, Thick clouds of dust choked the horses' respiratory tracts and broke axles in deep ruts. The maximum physical speed of a heavily loaded horse-drawn cart on such routes is exactly 19 miles per day. This is the absolute physiological limit of endurance for a draft horse, requiring long rests, regular watering, feeding, and periodic shoeing changes. A living horse is not a perpetual motion machine. It physically cannot run non-stop for days on end, dragging tons of cargo behind it. Now, let's take a map, a calculator, and start calculating. The distance from the nearest warm sea coast to Vienna is hundreds of miles, and the route from the coast of France or Holland to the center of Moscow is measured in thousands of miles. To deliver the cargo from the English Channel coast to the same Catherine II's residences near Moscow, a horse-drawn convoy moving at a speed of 19 miles per day would require from 40 to 60 days of continuous, grueling travel. Recall the biological timer. An oyster lives without water for a maximum of 5 days. Mathematics is merciless and unrelenting. The seafood was guaranteed to turn into a deadly poison already on the first third of the route, without even approaching the borders of the destination. No frequent horse changes at postal stations could compress space and time enough to cover nearly 2,000 miles in 5 short days on carts with wooden wheels over broken dirt roads. For that, the horse-drawn convoy would have to race at the speed of a modern high-speed train without stopping for a single second. Official scholars try to foist on us an absurd explanation that oysters were transported in barrels with seawater, which was constantly changed along the way. But stop and think. Where in the center of continental Europe, in the steppes or in the dense forests near Smolensk, could the convoy drivers obtain fresh seawater of the required salinity to sustain the finicky mollusks? How did they maintain ideal coolness in these barrels during the hot summer? This is yet another twist of logistical absurdity that historians prefer simply to ignore. Any attempt to justify this delivery within the claimed primitive technologies shatters against the granite wall of common sense. If we believe the textbooks, then every luxurious banquet of the nobility was a mass act of suicide, and the entire ruling elite of Europe should have ignominiously died out from the most severe poisonings even before the onset of the 19th century. However, they feasted, enjoyed seafood delicacies, and did not even suspect that centuries later, armchair theorists would attribute their grand logistical capabilities to ordinary horses. This oyster paradox is merely the first tiny crack in the foundation of a grand deception designed to hide the truth about our past. The mathematical inconsistencies in logistics irrefutably prove that the official transportation system of that era is nothing more than a facade concealing the true speeds of movement and the real capabilities of the lost world. If they could effortlessly and regularly deliver such finicky and perishable products across the entire continent, then we know absolutely nothing about the real technologies they possessed. But if you think that the oyster mystery is the limit of the impossible, you are deeply mistaken. This delivery pales in comparison to what was happening in the snow-covered latitudes of the northern empires, where the basic laws of nature were broken just as easily and elegantly. We move to the winter residences of the nobility to look at an even more egregious violation of the laws of thermodynamics and agronomy. Leaving behind the oyster paradox, which makes logic crack at the seams, we plunge into an even more absurd reality. If delivering seafood protein across half the continent raises insurmountable questions about transportation, then the next fact challenges the fundamental laws of thermodynamics and botany. In the Russian Empire of the 18th and 19th centuries, the months-long winter should have dictated harsh survival conditions. But the archives of the Sheremetev and Stroganov families, as well as customs records, document something unimaginable. It turns out that near St. Petersburg and Moscow, Under the harshest winter conditions, when the thermometer lingered for weeks at -22 degrees Fahrenheit, they mass-produced real tropical fruits. We're not talking about a couple of puny bushes in pots. The documents confirm industrial-scale production. In snow-covered Russia, thousands of select pineapples ripened successfully. There were so many that aristocrats not only served them at the table every day, but also exported these delicate fruits to Europe. Just think about the level of this surrealism. From snow-covered St. Petersburg, they shipped tropical pineapples for export. This fact is recognized by academic science. To grasp the scale of this agronomic madness, we need to break down the physiology of the tropical plant. The pineapple is an incredibly finicky crop that evolved in a stable, equatorial climate. This fruit does not forgive the slightest deviations from its temperature norm. For the bush to survive and bear fruit, it requires a strict temperature of around 77 degrees Fahrenheit, around the clock. If the temperature drops even to 61 degrees Fahrenheit, the plant suffers irreparable shock and begins to die. If the air heats up above 95 degrees Fahrenheit, the pineapple burns and dries out. In addition to the rigid temperature corridor, the exotic needs stable humidity and an abundance of light. In winter, when the daylight lasts only a few hours, and outside the window a blizzard rages, and the frost cracks at -22 degrees Fahrenheit, creating such conditions without electricity, grow lights, climate control, and humidification systems seems pure fantasy. But historians offer us an explanation that any modern agronomist would simply grab their head over. The official version states that the Stroganovs and Sheremetev's greenhouses were heated exclusively using decomposing horse manure. We are seriously told that serf peasants dug deep trenches, filled them with tons of excrement, added a layer of soil, and planted tropical plants. Supposedly, during the decomposition process, the manure released enough heat to sustain the life of finicky pineapples during 22-degree frosts. It sounds rustically ingenious. However, this picture is mercilessly shattered by the harsh laws of physics and logic. Yes, the biological decay of organics does indeed release thermal energy, but this process is absolutely uncontrollable. Decomposing manure cannot be tuned to maintain a stable 77 degrees Fahrenheit. It works like a time bomb. In the first days of active decomposition, the temperature inside such a bed can spike to 140 degrees Fahrenheit and higher, literally boiling the roots of the exotic plant alive. Immediately after the active burning phase, the decomposition process inevitably declines and the temperature drops sharply. How could peasants at night, in the height of epiphany frosts, regulate the heat output of the manure pile so that it didn't cool to the critical 61 degrees Fahrenheit? The answer is obvious. They couldn't. Moreover, the decomposition of biological masses releases not only heat, but also enormous volumes of ammonia, hydrogen sulfide, and methane. Without powerful industrial ventilation, this toxic cocktail would simply burn the pineapple leaves in a couple of days and poison any gardener entering the greenhouse. And if windows were constantly opened for ventilation, icy air at -22 degrees Fahrenheit would instantly rush in, and the tropical fairy tale would end in seconds. In addition, humidity fluctuations inevitable from evaporation from rotting masses guaranteed the formation of mold and fungi that kill pineapples faster than the cold. It turns out that official science asks us to believe in a miracle that violates basic chemical reactions. They want us to believe that a pile of excrement replaced complex climate control. Let's finish off this academic myth with the laws of thermodynamics and building physics. Think about the enclosing structures of the giant pre-revolutionary greenhouses. For pineapples to get any light at all, The greenhouses had to have enormous glazing areas. At that time, only single-pane glass of rather low quality was produced. There were no multi-chamber double-glazed windows with inert gas inside and heat-reflective coatings. The thermal conductivity of single, thin glass is colossal. It practically does not retain heat. Imagine a glass hangar outside of which a blizzard howls and the temperature drops to -22 degrees Fahrenheit. What amount of energy needs to be continuously generated inside to compensate for the monstrous heat losses through thousands of square feet of icy glass and maintain 77 degrees Fahrenheit in every cubic foot of air? No wood-burning stoves placed in the corners, and certainly not trenches with rotting manure, are physically capable of handling such a thermodynamic task. A stove heats the air around it, creating scorching heat, but 33 feet away from it, at the icy windows, the temperature inevitably drops to 32 degrees Fahrenheit. Heat guns and fans for even distribution of hot air, according to historians, had not yet been invented. Tropical fruits would simply rot at the cold glass or burn at the red-hot stoves. No golden mean is achievable with the claimed technologies. This pineapple empire in the snows is not evidence of peasant ingenuity. It is screaming proof that the official paradigm is deeply flawed. Those who built these greenhouses possessed technologies for generating powerful, clean, stable energy, and impeccably managed the microclimate on an industrial scale. They did not depend on burning firewood or organic decay. The tension is only building, because the deeper we delve into the daily life of the 19th century, the more terrifying it becomes. From the scale of the hidden truth, and if heat at -22 degrees Fahrenheit gives you a shiver of doubt, then wait until we peek into the dark underground chambers, where millions of tons of ice were stored in summer without a single kilowatt of electricity. What we will discover there will finally demolish the physics of the official past. If the ability to generate colossal volumes of heat at -22 degrees Fahrenheit without electricity forces academic science to nervously invent absurd fairy tales about warming, rotting manure, then the next chapter of our investigation will deliver the final, devastating blow to official school physics. We are moving from the paradox of extreme winter heating to the absolute impossibility of extreme summer cooling. Welcome to the era of the so-called ice industry of the 18th and 19th centuries. Official history reports to us quite imperturbably that 200 years ago, a gigantic, incredibly profitable industry of trading frozen water flourished around the world. We're not talking about pitiful, small pieces of ice for cooling a couple of glasses of wine at a party. Documentary archives record the extraction, transportation, and long-term storage of millions of tons of ice annually. This ice was loaded by hundreds of thousands of tons into the damp holds of wooden sailing ships and sent across raging oceans to the sweltering heat of India, Australia, and South America. Aristocrats and wealthy city dwellers of continental Europe and the Russian Empire used ice throughout the entire summer in unimaginable, truly industrial quantities to preserve perishable products, prepare desserts, and cool drinks in the 86-degree August heat. And all this, as we are insistently assured, happened without a single electric compressor, without freon, and without the slightest understanding of the principles of modern mechanical cooling. Historians offer us an extremely simple, peasant-like, naive scheme of how this global industry worked. Supposedly, in the height of winter, when rivers and lakes were gripped by frost, entire armies of hired workers went out onto the ice with handheld metal saws. They laboriously and persistently sawed out huge, multi-ton blocks, then manually loaded them onto horse-drawn sleighs and hauled them to gigantic underground storages, which were popularly called ice houses. We are told, with a knowing look, that these storages were just very deep pits or huge stone cellars lined with ordinary porous brick and generously covered with a thick layer of straw or wood shavings. According to the official academic version, this primitive and cheap thermal insulation was quite sufficient for millions of tons of ice to safely last until the very end of the hot August, without melting under the scorching summer sun. On the yellowed paper of old archives, and in the absolute silence of university libraries, this neat theory looks almost convincing. But as soon as we descend into the harsh, real world, take a basic thermodynamics textbook in hand, and analyze the real physical properties of building materials, this beautiful fairy tale crumbles to dust with a deafening crack. Let's start with the main myth that historians have firmly drilled into the heads of gullible laypeople. The myth that a saving cold always reigns deep underground. This is a fundamental error that categorically contradicts basic geology. The Earth's surface does indeed freeze deeply in harsh winter, but as soon as we descend below the frost line, the ambient temperature becomes remarkably stable and, most importantly, exclusively positive. In mid-latitudes, at depths of 10 to 20 feet, the soil maintains a temperature of 46 to 54 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. The Earth is a colossal, inexhaustible thermal accumulator that continuously radiates stored energy. When you take an ice block at around 32 degrees Fahrenheit and place it in an environment where the massive walls are at 50 degrees Fahrenheit, an inexorable heat exchange process starts instantly. According to the immutable laws of physics, heat always transfers from the hotter body to the cooler one. The huge brick or stone walls of the underground icehouse, in tight contact with warm groundwater and sun-warmed summer soil, inevitably acted as giant heating radiators, continuously and aggressively transferring heat into the enclosed space directly onto the frozen blocks. But the constant influx of external heat is not the most terrible trial for the ice. The main and most merciless enemy of any frozen mass is not just positive temperature, but high humidity and liquid water. As soon as the uppermost thin layer of ice in this underground brick cellar began to melt slightly from inevitable contact with warm air and heated walls, water formed. And now let's recall the harsh physics of phase transitions and thermal conductivity. The thermal conductivity of liquid water exceeds that of ordinary air by about 25 times. Water trickling down the cold ice blocks instantly destroyed their crystalline structure, acting as a powerful catalyst for further melting. In a hermetically sealed underground bunker, with no modern forced ventilation or industrial air dehumidification systems, humidity would instantly reach the absolute maximum of 100%. Under such unbearable conditions, the melting process of the gigantic ice mass takes on an avalanche-like, uncontrollable, exponential character. Official storytellers stubbornly insist that ordinary sawdust and dry straw saved the ice from inevitable doom, but this is yet another egregious violation of common sense and the laws of chemistry. Straw and wood shavings are 100% hygroscopic materials. They act like a giant natural sponge, greedily absorbing any moisture from the surrounding humid air and directly from the melting ice. Once soaked, these natural materials almost instantly and completely lose all their vaunted thermal insulation properties. Wet, ice water-soaked straw conducts destructive heat just as excellently as liquid water itself. Moreover, damp organics in a closed, dark, and humid room with constant positive temperature immediately begin to rot. Recall how historians enthusiastically justified growing tropical pineapples with the incredible heat from rotting horse manure. Here, in the deep ice houses, the exact same merciless biological laws are at work. Soaked straw and swollen wood shavings inevitably begin to decompose, releasing a colossal amount of unwanted thermal energy directly onto the unprotected surface of the ice. What, by the design of naive ancestors, was supposed to serve as a reliable insulator, in harsh reality would turn into a real thermal furnace, mercilessly destroying precious reserves in mere weeks. By the beginning of hot June, instead of crystalline, transparent blocks of pure ice, these brick underground chambers would contain a huge, foul-smelling puddle of murky, stale water and rotting, slimy straw. It is impossible to preserve hundreds of thousands of tons of frozen water until the sweltering August in porous brick cellars without modern high-tech airtight insulation, without thick layers of polyurethane foam, without perfect waterproofing membranes, and, most importantly, without active industrial refrigeration units constantly removing heat outward. Look at the complex architecture of the preserved ancient ice houses, which today are passed off as simple cellars. These are the most complex, mind-boggling engineering structures with massive brick vaults, perfectly designed wall geometry, and colossal internal volumes. Why waste colossal resources and build such monumental, incredibly expensive buildings if, according to the official version, they were 100% doomed to complete flooding with dirty meltwater every summer? The answer lies in the fact that these grand structures were never, in their history, simple, primitive pits for storing winter ice. The architectural precision, calculated wall thickness, and specifics of the materials used irrefutably indicate that what we have before us are not raw material warehouses, but the most complex technological nodes. Academic history stubbornly forces us to believe in a primitive world where people fought nature exclusively with hand saws, exhausted horses, and rotting straw. But thermodynamics is merciless. The 19th century ice industry could not exist in principle with the claimed technologies. The ice would melt much faster than it could be delivered to the consumer. We are smoothly and inexorably led to a frightening conclusion. Cooling vast spaces and gigantic masses was achieved by entirely different, hidden physical methods. Let's set aside emotions, forget about decay paradoxes, and simply calculate the energy cost and logistical burden of the official transportation system of the 18th and 19th centuries. Historians persistently paint us a picture of a world in which the entire economy, all trade, and all cargo movements in land empires relied exclusively on the muscle power of draft horses. We are asked to believe that millions of tons of grain, timber, building stone, coal, oysters, pineapples, and ice were moved daily across the vast expanses of Eurasia and America on wooden carts. This picture seems familiar only until we begin to scrupulously calculate the calories needed to sustain this gigantic living mechanism. Let's turn to strict physiological norms and zootechnical standards. An ordinary working horse performing heavy draft work, for example, pulling a heavy carriage with oysters along a dirt road or sleighs loaded with ice blocks, is not just a means of transportation. It is a living biological engine requiring colossal volumes of high-calorie fuel. To maintain the performance of one such horse per day requires a minimum of 33 pounds of quality oats and about 22 pounds of good, dry hay, plus a huge amount of clean water. This is the absolute minimum necessary for the animal's survival under constant high loads. If the horse is underfed, it rapidly loses weight, falls ill, and dies right in the harness. Now let's extrapolate these figures to the scale of an entire empire. To sustain the level of trade and luxury described in official documents, endless bulls, daily deliveries of fresh products, transportation of building materials for erecting grand cities would require tens of millions of draft horses. Now let's grab a calculator and start simple but devastating mathematics for official history. Imagine an army of just 1 million working horses. This million animals requires 15,000 tons of oats and 10,000 tons of hay daily, without weekends or holidays. Over a year, that amounts to astronomical 5.5 million tons of oats and nearly 4 million tons of hay. And that's only for 1 million horses. There should have been tens of millions of them. Where, in the harsh climate of the Russian Empire or Northern Europe, with their short summers and risky agriculture, were such unimaginable volumes of high-quality feed grown? How were these colossal harvests gathered without modern tractors, combines, and mineral fertilizers, relying solely on manual labor of serfs with sickles and scythes? How and where were these mountains of grain and hay dried, threshed, and, most importantly, stored, protecting them from dampness, rodents, and fires? The mathematical collapse of this system is obvious. To feed the transport horses, it would be necessary to sow all available arable land with forage crops, leaving not a single acre for growing wheat or rye to feed the population itself. People would simply starve to death trying to feed their transport. But the logistical nightmare doesn't end there. The collected and stored feed had to be delivered to the horses themselves along their entire route. A convoy carrying oysters from Paris to Moscow couldn't rely on random meadows along the road, especially in autumn or winter. Therefore, a significant portion of the useful cargo in every cart had to consist precisely of feed for the draft animals. Each horse, pulling the load, ate part of that load every day. On long journeys, a mathematical paradox arises. At a certain point on the route, the horse eats all the feed it itself is carrying, leaving no room for useful commercial cargo. This is the so-called curse of draft logistics, which makes overland transportation of heavy loads over distances exceeding several hundred miles economically senseless and physically impossible without the most powerful, continuous supply infrastructure on every mile of the route. But we know the condition of the roads back then. They were predominantly dirt tracks, washed into impassable mud by rains and snow covered in winter. Creating and maintaining a network of gigantic feed warehouses along thousands of miles of such roads was simply unrealistic. Let's add another shocking fact to this equation. A horse is a living organism, and the process of digesting colossal volumes of feed inevitably leads to the formation of waste. One working horse produces about 33 pounds of manure and up to 2.6 gallons of urine daily. If tens of thousands of horses entered a major city like St. Petersburg, Moscow, London, or Paris daily to supply the residents with firewood, ice, food, and materials, the streets would instantly drown in hundreds of tons of foul-smelling manure. Official history tries to convince us that this manure was promptly removed by street sweepers with brooms and carted away on wagons. But where to? And who cleaned up after the horses that carted away the manure? This is a closed logistical circle of absurdity. In reality, major cities would simply suffocate in anti-sanitary conditions, and epidemics of cholera and typhus would mow down the population in mere months. No street sweepers could cope with the daily tsunami of biological waste generated by an army of transport animals. Mathematical and demographic analysis inexorably proves the logistics of banquets and daily supplies in the 18th and 19th centuries physically could not rely on primitive draft traction. The balance of calories, yields, road capacity, and biological waste does not add up in official documents with a colossal, fatal discrepancy. This system, based exclusively on horses and manual labor, collapses under the weight of its own mathematical contradictions. Therefore, all these tons of fresh oysters, pineapples, ice, and building stone were delivered by an entirely different method. Historians painted us a fake scenery of a dirty, horse-dependent world to hide the true reality. They concealed from us a high-tech, incredibly efficient, and powerful transportation and energy infrastructure, that provided comfort and speeds comparable to modern ones, and possibly surpassing them. Horses and carriages were merely a small part of the picture, a toy or transport for local trips. All these paradoxes, which historians diligently hide behind the thick covers of dusty dissertations, scream one thing. The world of the recent past functioned according to completely different physical and climatic laws. It's time to cast aside the last illusions and face the reality, which is much more fantastic than any fiction. Forget about global floods, comets, and other mysticism. The truth lies in hard engineering, alternative thermodynamics, and stolen atmospheric energy. We are approaching the very essence of the global deception, and the key to unraveling this mystery is the event that official science shyly calls the year without a summer. Let's transport ourselves to the year 1816. Academic reference books dryly inform us that due to the mythical eruption of some distant volcano in Indonesia, the planet was supposedly enveloped in ash, causing sharp cooling, crop failures, and snow in the middle of July in Europe and North America. We are presented with this as a random climatic anomaly, but if we compare this year with our previous investigations of the pineapple and oyster paradoxes, the picture changes radically. The year 1816 is not a coincidence. It is a turning point. It is the point of global climatic and technological shift. All irrefutable evidence of luxurious feasts with the freshest tropical fruits in snow-covered street. Petersburg and oysters in Vienna pertains predominantly to the era before this turning point. What if before the beginning of the 19th century, the Earth's climate was completely different? What if there were no harsh, life-killing winters in the mid-latitudes? Imagine a unified, global greenhouse climate, a stable biosphere where temperatures were uniform and the atmosphere was denser and more energy-rich. In such a climate, pineapples could grow near St. Petersburg, not thanks to rotting manure and thin single-pane glass, but because the external environment was favorable to them, and minimal temperature fluctuations were easily corrected using technologies we today don't even suspect existed. But if the climate was warm and stable, where did that very ice come from, which was stored by the thousands of tons in gigantic underground structures? Here we come to the most grandiose exposure. Those very cyclopean underground storages, which historians contemptuously call ice houses or stone cellars, were never primitive pits for storing frozen lake water. Carefully examine their architecture. Powerful brick vaults, perfectly calibrated spatial geometry, the presence of deep wells, a complex system of ventilation shafts, and strict orientation to the cardinal directions. These are not warehouses. These are the most complex technical nodes, grand machines bricked up in the ground. These were atmospheric cooling stations and cold generation facilities. They did not run on socket electricity or coal combustion. They utilized entirely different principles of thermodynamics. Principles of absorption cooling, employing atmospheric pressure differentials, ether technologies, and atmospheric electricity. Let's recall the physics of the absorption cooling process, which is still used in industrial refrigerators without compressors or moving parts. For such a system to operate, only a heat source and the right refrigerant are needed, such as ammonia or water. In the era before 1816, under conditions of a denser atmosphere saturated with static electricity, these underground structures functioned as gigantic thermodynamic pumps. They captured atmospheric energy, utilized the Earth's natural heat and pressure differentials in a complex system of brick shafts and channels, creating an artificial, deep sub-zero temperature inside the chambers. Ice was not stored in them. Ice was continuously produced in them. directly from atmospheric moisture or piped water. These stations were capable of generating colossal volumes of cold completely autonomously, without fuel costs. That's why they were built on such a grand scale and with such architectural precision. They formed the basis of the global cooling infrastructure, ensuring food freshness, comfort in a hot climate, and the most complex logistical chains. It was precisely these atmospheric cold generators that allowed maintaining ideal temperatures to preserve the freshness of sea oysters during transportation. Carriages and wagons carrying perishable cargo were not just wooden boxes on wheels, but mobile refrigerators using miniature analogs of these atmospheric installations. Ether technologies allowed extracting energy literally from the air, ensuring uninterrupted operation of the cooling circuits throughout the entire journey. Speeds of movement along special highways, paved with perfect precision, far exceeded the capabilities of ordinary horses. Horses were merely a supplement, an element of local traction, while the main logistical arteries functioned on principles of wireless energy transmission and atmospheric engines. This explains how finicky mollusks reached Moscow alive, and millions of tons of cargo were moved without the collapse of the draft system. But this perfect, harmonious, and environmentally clean system was doomed. The year 1816 became not just a year of climatic anomaly. It was the year of deliberate destruction of the unified atmospheric dome. A colossal shift occurred, leading to a sharp change in atmospheric density, a drop in its energy capacity, and, as a result, a radical climate change. Harsh winters set in. Tropical plants near St. Petersburg died, and the gigantic atmospheric cooling stations, deprived of etheric sustenance, turned into useless cold cellars that the surviving people habitually used as primitive storages for ice sawed from frozen rivers. The loss of these technologies threw humanity into dark ages, forcing it to survive using horses, firewood, and rotting manure. We stand on the threshold of realizing that our entire history of the 19th century is a chronicle of survival amid the ruins of a destroyed high-tech civilization. But the main question, which makes the blood run cold, remains open. Who and why pressed this reset button? For what was the clean atmospheric energy destroyed? And why were we driven into slavery to fossil fuels? The decisive moment of truth has arrived. We have traveled a long, winding path, from absurd stories about warming, rotting manure and horses suffocating in dust, to a crystal-clear understanding that the year 1816 became not just a random climatic catastrophe, but the point of irreversible, artificially provoked collapse of the entire human civilization. The most terrifying, most logical and paralyzing question arises. Who and why needed to destroy this perfect, harmonious, and incredibly high-tech world? Why was it necessary to coldly dismantle the global energy infrastructure that provided humanity with clean atmospheric energy, allowed autonomous generation of icy cold from invisible ether, and grew delicate tropical fruits in any northern latitudes without burning millions of tons of toxic fuel? The answer lies in the most fundamental, darkest foundation of any boundless dictatorship: in absolute control over resources and total monopolization of energy distribution. Free atmospheric energy, based on natural pressure differentials, laws of acoustic resonance, and obtaining static electricity directly from the air, was the main, existential enemy of the emerging new global elite. Ether energy cannot be locked in a rusty iron barrel. It cannot be weighed on port customs scales. It is absolutely impossible to hang a mechanical meter on it and force people to pay monthly for every kilowatt consumed. The technologies of the lost past give humanity incredible, frightening for any rulers, autonomy. Free people, possessing independent, inexhaustible sources of heat, cold, and the ability for unlimited, rapid movement, would never become submissive slaves, would not voluntarily go to work in dark and dangerous coal mines for meager wages, and would not kill each other for illusory control over oil wells. To subjugate the entire planet and build a new, unprecedentedly harsh financial hierarchy, the architects of the New World Order vitally needed to create an artificial, all-encompassing scarcity. It was precisely for this that the global, ruthless reset of the 19th century was carried out. The destruction of the unified atmospheric dome and the radical change in Earth's climate became only the very first stage of the grandiose, inhumane plan to enslave humanity. Deprived of instant access to infinite etheric energy, our recent ancestors became absolutely defenseless in the face of suddenly arriving harsh, life-killing winters and the instantly collapsed world logistics. And then, the new masters of the world offered the freezing, starving, and plunged into deep despair humanity their salvific alternative, which forever shackled us in invisible fetters of the harshest economic dependence. We were given dirty coal, and then toxic oil. We were forced to sacredly believe that the mass burning of dead organics, accompanied by suffocating black smoke, thick soot, and the heaviest, grueling physical labor of millions of powerless workers, is the greatest technological progress and the absolute triumph of human engineering thought. The so-called Industrial Revolution, which all modern school textbooks praise with such unfeigned pathos and pride, in harsh and unglamorous reality, was a colossal step backward, the most severe technological degradation and a forced transition of the entire planet to a civilization of primitive, dependent stokers. Ponder the truly horrifying and paralyzing scale of this cynical historical crime. The entire world chronology known to us was coldly rewritten, literally in just a few short decades, to forever eradicate from people's genetic memory the very idea that vital energy can originally be absolutely free and accessible to every inhabitant of the planet. Genius underground atmospheric cooling stations, capable of generating hundreds of tons of ice completely autonomously right from the surrounding air, were contemptuously called primitive peasant cellars for storing winter blocks. Majestic, bright greenhouses, operating uninterruptedly on the most complex physical principles of etheric thermoregulation, were humiliatingly and absurdly attributed to the life-giving heat from rotting horse excrement. Fast land transport arteries, using hidden magnetic lines and powerful fuel-free atmospheric engines, were deliberately buried in dirt, erased from the face of the earth, and declared ordinary dirt tracks along which supposedly exhausted draft horses slowly and painfully crawled, with heavy barrels of rapidly spoiling sea oysters. Official academic science became the main, sharpest, and most effective tool of this total mental enslavement. Professors hired by corporations diligently created fake state archives, wrote multi-volume lying treatises on the incredible endurance of animals, and proved the obviously impossible, forcing us to sincerely believe that our great ancestors were illiterate savages in dirty rags, completely and utterly dependent on the cruel whims of wild nature. They stitched this grand historical fake with the coarsest white threads, without even bothering to properly balance the elementary mathematical account of consumed fodder calories, check the immutable laws of thermodynamics, or simply calculate the biological rate of decay of delicate protein. They were absolutely and self-confidently convinced that no one and never would dare to openly doubt the irrefutable authority of the printed word of official university professors. But this global academic deception physically could not last forever. Today, when we are forced every month to hand over our last hard-earned savings to transnational energy corporations for every insignificant degree of warmth in our concrete homes and for every gallon of gasoline in our cars, we are beginning to awaken en masse and inexorably. We live in an artificially created, illusory world of triumphant scarcity, where a pitiful handful of corporate monopolists firmly holds its iron hand on the global gas and oil valve, impunely dictating its irrefutable will to entire sovereign continents and billions of people. The entire modern world economy, all cynical geopolitics, all bloody armed conflicts and destructive wars are built exclusively around one single, maximally base goal: total control over dirty fossil resources. And the most terrifying, the most tragic thing is that we sincerely and naively consider this parasitic, slowly destroying our native planet way of life an undoubted and great pinnacle of human evolution. We have voluntarily become obedient and silent sponsors of a ruthless system that brazenly stole from us our rightful, incredibly high-tech past heritage. Every time you submissively pay the next astronomical bill for electricity, for winter heating, or buy expensive products whose delivery is tightly controlled by fuel monopolists, always remember one incredibly important thing. You are right now paying humiliating, endless tribute for that very global reset of the 19th century. With your own hard labor, you are paying for what once belonged to all humanity by right of birth, but was cynically taken away by force, unprecedented cunning, and a global, multi-century deception. You are now armed with steel logic, irrefutable harsh mathematics, and merciless laws of physics that shatter to smithereens, without the slightest chance of restoration, the fragile and fake glass castles of academic lies. It is physically impossible to unsee and forget what you have just realized. The deadly oyster paradox, blooming tropical pineapples in the harsh Russian snows, and the impossible thermodynamics of the vanished ice industry. These are no longer just amusing historical curiosities from old, dusty books. These are screaming, bleeding, and irrefutable clues, carelessly left to us right at the site of the greatest and most cynical crime against all humanity. They simply forgot to erase these small traces in time, arrogantly considering us too stupid, too lazy, and too submissive to independently put together this complex informational puzzle into one. But we categorically no longer agree to blindly and thoughtlessly swallow their beautifully packaged, fake academic truths.